Everybody in the UK, and good afternoon to everybody in Australia. So thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm very excited by this workshop that we've got today. This is the first time we've done this as a joint UK Australia event. Delighted as well to be doing this with our partners. Sorry, I should have introduced myself. My name is Paul Jordan. I'm from the Energy Systems Catapult. I look after our innovator support and also international activities. And we're delivering this workshop in partnership with Austrade, and really appreciate all the help that they've given to setting this up. Just to set the sort of objectives for today. I visited Australia in the not too distant future. It was in the times when FaceTime actually meant you could meet somebody in person, and meeting many of the stakeholders in Australia, I recognised that whilst there's very different drivers behind the changes that are Australia's undergoing with their energy systems, the outcomes and the needs are often very similar. Around the sort of need for smart energy system flexibility, the challenges of future electrification of transport, the challenges around variable renewable energy, etc., etc. So I felt that this was something that maybe we should explore together as two countries, see really whether there are common challenges which could then be evolved into common collaboration opportunities. And that's really the objectives of today. We really want to sort of share views and ideas and challenges across both countries, and ultimately try to see if there's a few areas where perhaps we can come together and try and develop some propositions and some programs where we can collaborate to solve those common challenges. So let's see how we get on. I'm hoping that maybe we'll have some follow-up to this, and please do share all of your thoughts and opinions today. Just in terms of the housekeeping, obviously, please do keep your systems on mute. Also, we really do want a very active and dynamic chat room. So somebody will be monitoring that. We will be posting some questions on the chat room. So you know, do get some good lively debate going in there. We will be collating all of the findings and thoughts and comments from today, whether that's in the video conference or the chat room. And also we will be posting some poll questions as well, just to try and get some, you know, a little bit of statistics behind this workshop as well. So I think Tabitha will be launching that first poll shortly. And again, you know, please try to respond to those if you can. That would be really, really helpful. So we're going to start with a couple of introductory presentations, one from the UK, one from Australia, and then we're going to go into 3 panel sessions to discuss topics around consumers, networks, and then transport. So let's get underway, and I'll start by introducing Guy Newey. He's our Director of Strategy at the Energy Systems Catapult, has extensive experience from working in government in the UK, and he oversees our policy, marketing and communications team at the Catapult, as well as the strategic direction, and was also a previous special advisor to one of the Secretary of State. So extensive experience of the UK energy system, and he's going to share some of his thoughts around where the UK market is going and maybe some of the challenges and opportunities that might be presented there. So over to you, Guy. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and great to be here this morning / afternoon. I'm not sure whether that means we've got more energy in the UK, or we're still waking up, or you in Australia at the end of a long day are exhausted, and this might be the perfect way to wind down. So 100 years time, when the historians are writing the history of Theresa May, for those of you who've forgotten, the UK Prime Minister for 3 years until Boris Johnson took over, what will they be writing about it? Well, no doubt they'll be writing about a pretty tumultuous 3 years in in power as the UK left the European Union, and the various kind of internal warfare that was going on in the Tory party. But of course, one of the other things they might write about is Theresa May's decision to move the UK to a net zero emissions target by 2050. And this is one of the last things she did while she was in power. Some cynics would say she was kind of legacy shopping and thinking about what that would mean. But whatever were her motivations, this has had an extraordinarily galvanizing and transformative effect on the debate in the UK around decarbonisation and low carbon. Led to this kind of a spate of big corporates announcing extraordinarily ambitious targets. So, the ones that are most notable are BP and Shell, both committing to net zero by 2050. Not quite sure how they're going to get there, but realizing that as a kind of corporate survival defense mechanism that they absolutely needed to do that. Just as a little aside, quite interesting to see how they're actually competing on this. As I was just doing my research over the weekend for this, I just typed in BP net zero just to check that I'd got the date right for their commitment. And of course, the first advert that pops up at the top is Shell net zero on Google, which I thought was cheeky as much as anything else. But it's a sign that actually this is a way of some of the big oil majors who've seen as kind of negative to the transition are actually competing, as it were. So this transformation has really kind of gathered pace over recent years, and it's a massive opportunity for lots of the innovators that we work with at the energy system Catapult, who are really trying to find new ways of tackling this problem. But just to put some numbers on the size of what this means for the UK market. So the government, in addition to the net zero, recently kind of gave a slightly more near-term target in the UK that they committed that they will reduce their emissions by 78% by 2035. Cue lots of kind of, oh, well done, another great green commitment. But what does that actually mean? So that, depending on which scenario you follow, that means 28 million electric vehicles on the roads of the UK by 2035. And we're on a couple of 100,000, maybe a bit more now. Extraordinary transformation, not just of the transport system and how we drive around, but obviously the impact on the electricity system. To meet that target, it's likely that around 40% of the homes in the UK would have to be decarbonised by 2035. That's up from kind of 5 or 6% at the moment. Again, an extraordinary transition in the kind of basics of our economy. 45 megatons of carbon capture and storage, which is at, when I last checked, zero in the UK context at the moment after a couple of failed competitions. An electricity system that could be running on 75% or more renewables, including many intermittent renewables. So just the size of this transition is absolutely enormous. So, your first question is not going to happen just by magic. This is going to require a lot of political commitment in order for these market sizes to be realized. Is there the level of political commitment we need to this? Well, at the end of last year, the Prime Minister announced his 10-point plan on net zero, included some fantastically ambitious targets around hydrogen, around heat pumps, around offshore wind, that will get to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. It's around kind of 10, 12 at the moment in the UK. Most interestingly, for those of like me looking for signs that they're actually serious about this stuff, was the decision to announce that from 2030 there'll be no sales of internal combustion engine cars. Hybrids will still last to 2035. But this is a sign that as a government was actually willing to take some political risk, which suggests that they are, when you start getting into things like cars, etc., you're starting to get into people's everyday their life. Now, of course, partly this was because the UK is hosting the UN climate change talks, the COP talks at the end of this year, but it's also driven by some real political calculation that green issues are becoming much more important, including for as a kind of hygiene factor often for people who are thinking of voting Conservative, certainly in the UK context. So these are some big. This is, you know, a huge transformation, as I say, and a great opportunity for lots of the brilliant companies that we work with. But what are the big challenges that sit under those, and the things that when I think about the transition I start getting nervous about? But of course that means you know, identify as a kind of great commercial opportunity. So first of all is, will the system work? Particularly, will the power system work? And in many ways, what we had last year with COVID and the kind of huge drop in demand in the UK as a result of the pandemic is we kind of had a postcard from the future on this. And I know this links to lots of the issues that are happening in Australia. That, you know, can our system cope with this switch to huge numbers of renewables and crucially a much more flexible demand side if you've got a lot more electrified vehicles and heating? And, you know, one of the big questions for us is, can you get the market design to align to this new set of physics? Because it's putting new pressure on networks, particularly on the low voltage and you know, will we have the EV infrastructure? As an owner of one of the owners of an EV in the UK, I can tell you that the infrastructure is not always great, particularly if you get outside your road. You know, so you have to work through that. So one big question is, can we get this system to work, particularly this power system? And some of the technologies around storage, etc., and flexibility will be absolutely essential as that, as well as getting digital technology to unlock some of this flexibility. Second big question is consumer acceptance. You know, consumers will have a veto on net zero. You can sign all the targets you want, etc., but if the politics gets too hard or people don't accept some of the changes that are expected of them, then they will and they'll either take to the streets or they'll take to the ballot box. And so, you know, that gets particularly sensitive in the UK context around buildings and homes. So how do we come up with low carbon offers that people actually want in terms of how they heat and increasingly cool their homes? And again, digital technology and some of the companies we work with has a significant area. And then you've got a whole list of kind of big tech questions that you've got to work through, whether it's nuclear power, CCUS, industrial decarbonisation, direct air capture, fusion, etc., etc. You know, there's kind of big industrial policies that need to be thought through, and the UK understanding its part in the wider debate. So this is, you know, to set the context for this very timely debate, this is an extraordinary moment. It's full of risk and challenges, about technological innovation, about consumer acceptance, about, you know, big technology and small technology, about digitalization, and about the energy transformation. So the country that is able to seize this opportunity to come up with the low carbon products and services that work, and that work for consumers and give consumers better outcome, are going to be in an incredible position. And I think the UK and Australia are at the forefront of understanding what that transition really means. Thanks.
Thanks, Guy. That was excellent. Very good overview. So let me now hand over to hear the Australian side. So we've got Steve Refreshage, who's the manager for distributed energy and demand management at the Australia Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resource. So Steve, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. As Paul said, I'm standing in here. So normally it would be Chris McCoy presenting this, who's the Australian Counsellor to Europe from the department. She was unavailable, so I'm picking up the presentation for her. So we can go to the next slide. I'll give you a bit of an overview of Australia's electricity system and governance before I go into some of the policy measures towards the end of the presentation. So this first slide You can see on the right-hand side what we call the National Electricity Market, the NEM, which runs separately from the rest of Australia. The Southwest Interconnected System on the left-hand side there in Western Australia, and the Northwest Interconnected System are separate. The next two largest grids in Australia are completely separate networks. But most of this presentation focuses on the right-hand image, the NEM, which commenced operation as a wholesale spot market for electricity in 1998. And it operates on one of the world's longest interconnected power systems, from the north of Queensland right down to Tasmania and across to South Australia, a distance of around 5,000 kilometres, and it incorporates around about 40,000 kilometres of transmission lines and cables. The NEM generates around 200 terawatt hours of electricity annually, supplying about 80% of Australia's electricity consumption, and has a total generating capacity of about 55 gigawatts. Importantly, about 10 gigawatts of that comes from distributed solar, mostly rooftop solar. The electricity industry in Australia is one of Australia's largest industries, providing energy for around 10 million customers across industry, businesses and households. Next slide. So the generation mix in the NEM is dominated by coal-fired generation, supported by gas and renewables. Total renewable generation is approaching around a quarter of generation in the NEM, that eastern side of Australia. Next slide. But this is all changing. The Australian National Electricity Market is undergoing significant transition characterised by a thermal generation fleet that's scheduled to progressively retire in the coming decades. They reach the end of their technical lives. So over the past decade, we've seen about 12 of Australia's coal-fired generators exit the market, which has removed over 5 gigawatts of dispatchable, reliable, low-cost electricity from the system. And another 12 power stations are expected to close between now and 24, which represents around about 2/3 of the remaining fleet. We're also seeing significant and rapid uptake of variable renewable energy and distributed energy resources, mainly rooftop solar, with renewable investment reaching unprecedented levels over the last 6 years. Recent investment has been driven by a combination of factors, which includes our renewable energy target, which is a type of white certificate scheme that I think some on the line will be familiar with, which technically ended this year in terms of driving new investment in renewable energy, but the scheme as a white certificate scheme continues on, so the target isn't increasing anymore, and the target has been met, but it remains open. So the value of those certificates declines over time now. But it's also, this renewable energy investment is also being driven by elevated electricity prices that have come down a bit recently in Australia, but also the declining costs of renewable energy technologies has driven a lot of investment. So as a result, renewable capacity has continued to increase, more than doubling since 2015. And last year, Australia installed 7 gigawatts of new renewable capacity, which is about 4 megawatts of, it's 4 gigawatts of large scale and 3 gigawatts of small scale, mostly rooftop solar installations. And that was our largest year of installed capacity on record. So on the current slide, you'll see that the growth of renewables is set to continue. Renewable generation made up about 24% of Australia's electricity generation in 2020. And the department I work in, the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, has projected that by 2030, about half of our electricity will come from renewables. Wind and rooftop solar are expected to dominate renewable generation, with hydro and large-scale solar also playing an important role. And the large influx of intermittent energy sources, along with thermal generator closures, means new measures are needed to support reliability. This is the crux of our energy transition. We're seeing an exit of reliable dispatchable generation and a rapid influx of intermittent energy sources. The Australian government's addressing this by supporting investment in additional firming technologies like pumped hydro, battery storage, demand response, and gas. The government's also committed to supporting the transition to a low emissions economy, while at the same time providing reliable, secure, and importantly, affordable energy to industry and households. Next slide. So as I've said, the surge of renewable energy into the market in Australia, one of the characteristics of that is the very rapid uptake of rooftop solar. We've got more than 2.7 million small-scale power systems, which are less than 100 kilowatts by size. We've got more than 2.7 million installed across Australia on households and businesses. That represents more than 1 in 4 houses in Australia having rooftop solar, which is the highest rate of uptake of rooftop solar in the world. The high penetration of rooftop solar requires careful management to maintain security and reliability. And I can give you an example of that, where in South Australia last year, record generation from rooftop solar met and from distributed solar met 100% of demand in that state. This is the sort of the left-hand side of the NEM in that first image I showed you. On that day, South Australia set a new record for minimum operational demand of 300 megawatts. And so we're seeing new problems emerging where, operating the system at times of very low demand can cause disturbances to system security, like voltage control and frequency. And without emergency frequency control measures or other measures, this can lead to widespread system failures and outages. So it's got quite a few jurisdictions in Australia a bit nervous about what the future holds. So according to the Australian Energy Market Operator, which operates the NEM, by 2025, continued growth in rooftop solar is expected to cause daytime grid demand to drop to levels that will put reliability and security at risk. Rooftop solar inverters in Australia, we've found that they can behave unexpectedly and disconnect from the grid if there are voltage disturbances, which can cause mass disconnections at the same time, and that creates in itself security risks. So in Australia we've introduced new technical standards for solar PV inverters, which are being mandated from the end of this year, which will improve their ability to ride through voltage disturbances. And the government's also fast-tracking transmission projects, which will help to facilitate export of it'll help to facilitate the export of excess solar from those jurisdictions into other parts of the grid as well. So next slide. So how are we managing the transition? In terms of governance, we have across these three sort of, they're not really tiers of governance, but I'll go through them one by one. So we have a number of energy market bodies, which I'll explain on the next slide in a moment, but that's the Australian Energy Market Commission, the Australian Energy Market Operator, and the Australian Energy Regulator, along with the Energy Consumers Association and the Energy Security Board, who provide a long-term independent view on the market and design options. Then we have state governments who manage state-based targets and commitments, and they hold the regulatory power to intervene in the first instance if market design options fail to achieve desired outcomes or to address imminent risks. And we've seen some of those actions being taken in places like South Australia, who are really at the cutting edge of some of these, some of the issues that are being experienced by very high levels of rooftop solar, for example. And then there's the Commonwealth Government, which sets national policy, national policy direction, and intervention from the Commonwealth is sort of a last resort. So it's where there's insufficient action from market bodies or state governments that the government tends to be involved, and the Commonwealth tends to try to harmonise across the states and territories to get consistent policy across the NEM. So the next slide talks a bit more about the governance structures. So in May 2020, the Prime Minister of Australia announced the cessation of a body that some of you might recall, the Council of Australian Government, or COAG, which included the former COAG Energy Council, which has been replaced by the Energy National Cabinet Reform Committee, or ENCRC, and the Energy Ministers Meeting. These are ministerial forums for the Commonwealth, states and territories, and New Zealand to work together on priority issues of national significance and key reforms in the energy sector. And those two bodies are chaired by the Commonwealth Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, Angus Taylor. So energy ministers work closely with the Energy Consumers Australia and have oversight of the following energy market institutions, which are listed on this slide for the operation of the national energy markets. So the Energy Security Board, which on the far right there is just the logo, that's sort of a body that the board is, the board comprises the heads of these different market bodies on the left, and they sort of have whole of system oversight for the transition, and I'll explain a little bit more of the work that they're doing in a moment. The Australian Energy Market Commission is the rule maker and market developer, and the Australian Energy Market Operator is the system operator. The Australian Energy Regulator is the economic regulator and rule enforcer. So priorities under the Energy National Cabinet Reform Committee for 2021 include a number of it focuses on the very high priorities. Everything else is delegated down to the, or across perhaps sideways to the Energy Ministers Meeting. But the Energy National Cabinet Reform Committee is focusing on immediate measures to ensure reliability and security of the electricity grid going into the next summer. It's focused on the redesign of the national electricity market to take effect after 2025. And I will elaborate on this a little bit more in a moment, which is a package of reforms to unlock gas supply, improve competition in the market, and better regulate pipelines. And the reforms will ensure an affordable and reliable system that's intended to support job creation, economic growth, and benefit consumers. Next slide. The government is pursuing measures to maintain reliability in the network as variable renewables enter. And the Australian Energy Market Operator has developed an integrated system plan for the national electricity market. The second plan, so they're produced, I think, every 2 years. The second plan was released in 2020 and provides a roadmap for optimising consumer benefits as the grid transitions. And the government is fast-tracking every major priority transmission project outlined in the plan. Renewable energy zones identified in the plan have been identified as a way to coordinate investments in transmission, generation and storage investments to ensure new generation is supplied at lowest cost. Under the former coalition of Australian governments, the federal, state and territory energy ministers directed the Energy Security Board to establish a planning framework for renewable energy zones. In several states, including Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania, these are all states in the NEM, have also announced the implementation of renewable energy zones to facilitate the required infrastructure investment and enable further renewable energy investment. The Australian government is also establishing a $1 billion grid reliability fund. This fund will support investment in new energy generation, storage and transmission infrastructure, including pumped hydro, batteries and other grid stabilising technologies. And work's also progressing on the expansion of the Snowy Hydro scheme. That's the largest hydroelectric generator in Australia, to bring it to 2,000 megawatts, as well as the development of what's known as the Marinus Link interconnector, which is a 1,500 megawatt connector between Tasmania and mainland Australia. And these projects will significantly increase the availability of dispatchable resources into an increasingly variable mainland grid. Next slide. This is an infographic from the Integrated System Plan, and there's a lot of information on here, but the key things probably to focus on, I think, here is the expected changes to 2040 in those white circles there. So we're expecting to see about 15 gigawatts of coal retire from the market in that time frame. We're expecting to see a doubling of distributed energy resources. We'll see new variable renewable energy in the order of 26 gigawatts, and new dispatchable resources in the range of 6 to 19 gigawatts, which comprises mainly pumped hydro, batteries and gas.
Steve, yeah, I probably need to stop you there if that's okay, because I'm just conscious we've got quite a jam-packed schedule for the remainder of the panels. So thank you very much for that. That was a really great overview of what's happening in Australia, and really appreciate some of the clarification around the governance as well, because I met a number of those organisations. So let's move straight into the panel now. But before we do that, I just want to say we'll end the polling there. I mean, clearly some strong indication that there is a desire for collaboration there, which is great. And Tabitha, if we can end that poll and launch the next one. We'll also start posting some questions now as we go through the panels in the chat room. And I see already there's some great conversations going on there. And Guy and Steve, if I could ask you to respond to any questions that have been directed at you guys in the chat room, that would be much appreciated. So can I ask Vinod Tiwari, who's the head of business development of Power Ledger, which is a new innovator developing some new solutions for tracking and trading of energy, flexible services and environmental commodities, to turn his camera on. Also the chief exec of Energy Consumers Australia, Lynn Gallagher, who's got extensive experience. She's an economist by trade and also has previously had significant experience working for the Council of Australian Governments. And then our own Matt Lipson, who's a business leader for consumer insights here at the Energy Systems Catapult, who's again got extensive social science background and has been leading a lot of the programs that we have at the Catapult. So let's jump straight into the first question here. So Matt, maybe I could start with you. How important is the consumer for the energy system of the future?
Thanks, Paul, and morning, stroke, afternoon, evening, everybody. Yeah, I guess in a word, very, and I guess you want me to be brief because we're running out of time. But fundamentally, if you think about it, they pay for the system and they use the energy. So if the future system doesn't really give them the things they need from energy in a kind of simple, convenient, affordable way, they're not going to want to pick up the tab. And if they don't use it as it was designed to be used, then it's not going to perform as expected. And there's going to be an awful lot of problems. You know, any engineer who's ever built anything will tell you they need a spec. If there are problems, you know, probably in the end, the consumers aren't going to blame themselves. They'll probably blame the industry that delivered the thing and sent them the bill. So I think, you know, very, very important for the future if we are to, you know, get to net zero and build a kind of future that we all want to live in.
Thanks, Matt. And Lynn, just come to you, because I know Energy Consumers Australia has been looking at this question extensively across the country. So again, from your side, how do you see the consumer playing a role in the future energy system in Australia?
I'd just add two things to what Matt said and endorse those are exactly the same consumer expectations in Australia. The two additional things that I'd point to is we are actually wanting 9 million Australians to change the practices in their homes. When baseload power was available and cheap overnight, now power is cheap during the day. And so there's got to be a fundamental shift in social practice. And if we keep talking to them about incentives and smart meters and technology and how we're going to prod them and poke them, we're never going to get there. And the other thing that has been brought out, I think, in Steve Rasholi's presentation is we have 3 million consumers with rooftop on their home who feel that they've done that for independence. And we now need to persuade them that they're part of the energy system, being, you know, using their generation or controlling their generation in a way that benefits themselves and everybody else is something they want to do, when what they think they've done is buy a ticket for independence. So we have to change fundamentally the conversation with consumers, because as Matt says, you know, we have to persuade them and we have to get them on board.
Thank you. And Vinod, obviously you're out there trying to develop your business with new solutions targeted at a lot of the end user behavior. So I'd love to hear your perceptions. And also, I'm not sure whether you're also looking at both markets and whether you've got a perception from both UK and Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we are global, and I'll probably respond from a technological perspective as well. You know, pretty much expanding from where Lynn left. So 3 million rooftop solar in Australia. These customers pretty much invested to get you know, good return on investment, cheaper electricity bill, cleaner power. There is a need to now integrate their DERs, distributed energy resources, into creating the resiliency that the grid needs as well. Because obviously, you know, whilst it's made energy cheaper and cleaner, it's pretty clear from Steve Rashog's presentation, the deep duck curve that the grid's facing in Australia, UK, Germany, California, wherever we have high penetration of rooftop solar. So these consumers are not the consumers of yesteryears. You know, for 100 years, it was you know, you just turn power on and end of the month you get electricity bill. That was the involvement of consumer. But they are owning mini power station, and they are interacting with the grid in a different way now. So there is, of course, a deeper engagement, and therefore the digitization of the grid, more relevance for software solutions, which will start to sort of unpack additional revenue streams for these consumers, as well as additional service streams for the grid as well. And we talk about flexibility services. So these residential customers, businesses, they can use their own DERs to support the grid flexibility services as well for integrated batteries or integrated switching their consumer behavior, as Lynn mentioned, to respond to the grid conditions. So some of these, and also throw in one of the sort of new innovation that we just launched in Australia, the VB Solar Exchange in partnership with Carlton United Brewery. So these consumers are actually looking at different ways now to engage in brand loyalty program with the brand that they want to support. A company with sustainability target can actually procure energy from these rooftop solar owners and pay them in the goods instead of cashback. So, and meeting their own sustainability targets and creating that brand loyalty and engagement as well. So, this space is rapidly changing as the energy transition sets in. And the role for consumer, going back to the first comment, is so very, very important.
Yeah, great. Well, I'll come back to you in a bit later, actually, Vinod, because I would love to hear your views of what differences you're seeing between the two countries as well. But maybe go back to just Matt and Lynn a little bit here. Just wanted to delve in a little bit more around the sort of barriers here. So obviously, linking in the consumer is going to be absolutely critical for not only to achieve net zero, but also for innovators to grow their businesses, as we just heard from Vinod. So I just wonder if we could maybe get some views from both countries here on the barriers that we're facing here around, kind of linking, making a lot of these systems very much consumer centric. So, maybe start with you, Lynn, and just on the, from the Australia side.
I think there's a couple of things I'd probably go to around barriers, and it sort of almost might pick up the diversity of consumers point that's sort of coming across in the chat as well. So we've got very old retail business models and we've got very old pricing models, which are not fit for purpose. But we'd be wrong to think what consumers want is complexity. Some consumers want complexity if they can, take advantage of it by moving their electric vehicle charging to, peak to off-peak times and benefit. But most people want it pretty simple. So we're going to have a range of consumers, some who, can shift load and move it to off-peak, and then others who are going, just please keep it simple. So I think, we've just come out of a period of complexity and blaming consumers in Australia as well. So I think we've got to do something more in terms of innovation, in terms of what the consumers are being offered. I think the other thing I'd say is there's a widening energy divide in Australia, and that's partly age as well. So for a country that's prided itself on home ownership, we now have 35% of people renting. Most people under the age of 40 are renting. So traditional views of energy poverty or fuel poverty are changing when you've got half the population has the means to invest in energy efficiency or solar, and the other half, usually the younger ones, are in rental properties and not detached properties, so they don't have roofs. So we're going to have to come up with some interesting new developments as well in terms of shared assets around shared solar, shared storage, because storage at the local level, distribution level, is critical to unlocking load shifting and flexibility. So I'll leave it there and let Matt get a word in.
Over to you, Matt.
I would agree with everything Lynn said. So tiny minority of consumers seek complexity out, and actually there are a group who do that, and then they show off about it because that gives them kudos. And they're called early adopters, and or pioneers, and by definition they are the ones today with solar in the UK. Maybe there's a bigger market in Australia for that now, but with electric vehicles, with heat pumps, with smart kind of batteries and those sorts of things. Those are the people we're hearing from, but they do not reflect the same needs as most of the markets. We have to be very careful about listening to those voices, although we can learn from them and work with them, of course, but don't expect everybody to be the same. The divide that Lynn's talking about is also present in the UK, and is going to become an increasingly big issue, I think, as people struggle maybe to live ordinary lives if we don't think about their needs and factor that into the way we design and deliver policies and all the engineering. And you see as much diversity there, I think, as you do in the rest of the population. There is an age divide, I think, in the UK increasingly too, but that there is a lot of diversity. So that, I think, would be very sensible for both countries to get their heads together and kind of compare and contrast and understand the differences there, because I understand that diversity is going to be key. I would say the key barrier is there's no motive at the minute. So you don't hit a barrier until you're trying to move in a direction. At the minute, there's very little policy encouraging kind of consumers to do anything about it. Once there is, the challenge will be, how do you persuade people to buy and use low carbon transport, heating, cooling, and to use it in ways that suit the grid? And I guess, if we just push that complexity down streamed to consumers, that could end quite badly. So I think the opportunity here is to figure out how industry, governments can weave all of that complexity together to make consumers a very simple offer, like they have actually in automotive to some extent, certainly in telecoms. Your mobile phone is a very complicated piece of kit, but you don't have to figure out how all the widgets work. It just does what you need. And I think we could learn a lot from those sectors in the energy sector.
Great. And Vinod, as I say, from your perspective, I mean, as I say, you're out there trying to sell some innovative solutions in an evolving market here in both countries. So, I mean, yeah, how do you compare and contrast within your business at the moment?
Yeah, and I think Matt said something about not enough price signals or not enough incentives for consumers to really start engaging with the electricity systems per se. And that's where I think the market's starting to move, both in UK and Australia in different ways. So UK is probably taking the lead with the networks, encouraging the grid flexibility services, and pretty much changing their own role from DNOs to DSOs. So they are out there seeking that flexibility services that they need in a different way. In Australia, there's probably more of a punitive discussion on, you have too much of rooftop solar, you should not be allowed to export energy. Instead of maybe potentially looking at solutions, can you create these localized energy markets where through price signals, networks can actually enable, through dynamic network pricing, enable the use of network and use all the excess energy within the localized network, so that it doesn't really cause the reverse flow issues that the network's worried about. So these are, I suppose, some of the conversations that we are engaged in, and looking at how our technology can enable, the use of existing distributed energy resources, be it solar PV in Australia or batteries, as they're starting to make some impact as well. In UK, probably electric vehicles, the control over their demand response, the heating, cooling systems. So all of these will interact and work with distribution networks. So this is something new that was never thought of or never part of conversation before. So UK is taking the lead. Pretty much all the distribution networks are now engaged in and have their own platform in seeking these flexibility services, primarily coming from commercial industrial at this stage, but they're getting down to the residential consumer level. And Australia is grappling with how do we deal with all these excess rooftop solar. I mean, the state that I'm sitting in Western Australia, the biggest power station is the aggregated rooftop solar here. More than 1,200 megawatt of rooftop solar, and our other single largest power plant is probably 400 or 500 megawatt. So it does make a serious impact. But the software, the IT and the digitization of the grid offers those solutions in absolutely making the energy cheaper and cleaner for the consumer, but also improving the resiliency of the energy system through services back to the grid. Integration of these DERs for offering services back to the grid.
Fantastic. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there. That was, I mean, we could have carried on talking for a long time here, and I'm sure this will be the same for all the panelists. But hopefully, as I say, this event is hopefully the first of what might be many. So hopefully there'll be lots of future opportunities. So thank you very much for participating in there, and some really great thoughts there, as well as some really good collaboration areas that were coming through for that conversation. So thank you. So if you could turn off your cameras and mute, and then I'll just ask the next panelists on energy networks to come forward. So Mark Patterson, who's the Chief Strategy Officer and Manager Director of Stratagen Australia. Jill Caney, who's the General Manager for Networks at Energy Networks Australia. Mark Sprawson from EA Technology. And Phil Lawton from our power systems practice at the Energy Systems Catapult. So hi, everyone. Great. So again, let's jump straight into it. And Tabitha, if you could get in the chat room, just share the next panel question for the chat room. I can see there's lots of messages going through there. I haven't had a chance to have a look at any of those yet, but great to see that's active. So Phil, I'll just start with you. So again, bit of a general question here, just to kick us off. But what are the challenges energy networks are facing, both now, but also what you see them facing in the future?
Thanks, Paul. So this was a question which was really at the heart of the FPSA project that we worked on, the program which is continuing. And we really came up with 7 different factors. So the first one is it's the flexibility to meet the changing needs. But not only that, we don't really know what those requirements are going to be. We don't know how much of heat is going to be electrified. So we know there's going to be more demand, but we don't know how much. The second one is the obvious one, change of electricity generation. Obviously, we're moving towards renewables, which are weather dependent, and they don't provide the sort of the inertia and the fault current that we power engineers love. Third one links back to the previous session, really, that we need to create incentives for customers so that they can benefit when they do things which help the grid, and obviously the grid benefits too, because without that, why won't everybody just charge their EV when they get home from work? We still need to be able to recover from major events and emergencies, and that's one of the big problems. You can black start from a large coal-fired power station. Much harder to see how you're going to do that from distributed resources, but that's something that we're going to need to learn how to do. We're going to have to co-optimize much more. So transmission and distribution are going to have to work together much more closely. The demand side is going to have to work together much more closely. Storage to bring everything together rather than all operating our own little silos. And then we're going to have new parties emerging, aggregators, potentially the suppliers of the future, who will have a much greater role that they could take on deciding when to charge my EV, when to run my heat pump, so that they will be actually potentially offering me enhanced services and a discount because they can then meet my needs more cheaply. And then the last one that we identified is that there's going to be much more of a need to coordinate across vectors so that the electricity and the gas and the water will have to be operated much more together rather than as sort of separate independent entities.
Thanks, Phil. That's really helpful. Jill, could I come to you just to perhaps give the view from the Australia side?
So I guess I guess it's a much more practical situation as described by Steve, in that we're responding. I think everything we're doing in Australia is response. And so we're exploring, while we have been exploring markets at the distribution level, we haven't really looked at tariffs, although we are looking at export tariffs in Australia to help provide signals. But as we all know, tariffs are quite slow to change. They're not very responsive. So the things that we're looking at in Australia are the need to be dynamic, the need for more data. So we're all looking at smart meters and other forms of securing data. One of the critical things I think that we didn't really cover earlier is dynamic operating envelopes. So not only do you provide a financial signal, but you also give a technical signal on what's available, what capacity is available. And that's a very major focus of work for the distribution networks in Australia, as well as, and I've mentioned, tariffs. Also, I guess we talk about there's no transition to renewables without transmission. So getting that balance, as Phil said, between distribution and transmission. So there's a tension, I guess, there between how much more new transmission do you need in Australia to support larger generation when we've got 10 gigawatts of rooftop solar at the distribution level. So what is the balance there? And as Lynn mentioned, we're also exploring things like community batteries, distribution owned and connected batteries, which is seen as being able to help manage the network. This is not something that's very possible in the UK. It helps manage the network, but allows those that can't afford to buy their own batteries a role in participating in this new energy transition. So I think I'll stop there.
No, that's great. And Mark P, you've been looking at architectures extensively in Australia. I mean, you remember the event you recently led looking at international experiences there. Again, I'd just be really interested to hear your views around how we might be able to develop the right sort of frameworks or architectures or whatever to try and address many of the points that Phil and Jill has been talking about there, and also just your reflections on any differences between the countries. How is Australia or UK tackling this in different ways?
Yeah, great questions, Paul. So huge question, of course, and I guess when I think about a lot of these things, there's two ways of thinking about the future. One is present forward, and another is future back. And ideally, it's always good to be able to do both of those things. I guess there's a great quote in some of the FPSA work that you guys did, which said something to the effect that the power system changes ahead are transformational, not incremental. And so mixed up in many of these things, there are many incremental things that we need to do and respond to, but there's also a wide range of cross-cutting, whole system impacts that also play out. So it's a bit like this beautiful tapestry that you end up pulling on one thread and it starts bunching up somewhere else. And so I think, as you say, Paul, we're doing Strategies, doing a bunch of work here, looking at what FPSA work was done by the Catapult, which is great work. What similar work is happening in other parts of the world, and particularly North America. And in fact, we're working with Phil as well on some of that, Phil Lawton. And so I think generally the work that you've done, just briefly, is very helpful in terms of, if you like, taking that or bringing that future back perspective to say, as we stand out 5 or 10 years and we think about what are the whole suite of things that we need to be thinking about because of their interconnectedness, how do we map those out? How do we do that that's actionable? Because all of this is not just abstraction or theoretical, it's actually intended to enable much more efficient, practical response. So I think, in summary, the work that you all have done is very relevant. It's got a lot of application, probably in a lot of parts of the world. And I think certainly a number of aspects of which have relevance in this country.
Thank you. And Mark Spawson, EA Tech, I mean, obviously has been at the forefront of a lot of this work for many years, and I know is very active in both UK and Australia. I really welcome your views really on, well, what are you seeing as the sort of challenges and trends here, but also I'd like to start moving the conversation into where you see perhaps some of the collaboration opportunities are, given that you're out there, developing your own business in both countries.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. So, I mean, the challenges moving forward for networks, clearly, as Mark hinted at there, we were talking about transformational change rather than incremental change. So what that means is clearly huge impact on the way in which the business operates and the way in which the business makes decisions. Some of the key challenges that I think that maybe just to pick on a couple of things that have been touched on by some of the other panelists, a lot of this change is happening down at the low voltage end. So Jill talked about the need to still have transmission for the transition, which I completely agree for large scale renewables, but clearly for where people are connecting their EVs and they're electrifying their heating, or they're connecting their behind the meter storage systems and everything else, down at that low voltage end is where I think we're seeing the biggest change at the moment. And that applies both in the UK and in Australia. And how do you meet that? It's about being ready for that bow wave. So Guy in his introduction talked about the millions of EVs that we're saying in the UK will be on the road by 2030. Well, we're coming from a low base at the moment of a couple of 100,000. So how do you know when the best time is to get yourself ready for that? And how do you make sure you have the systems in place such that you're not acting essentially as a barrier? And I think what we have at the moment is a situation where we need to ensure that the networks are a huge enabler of the drive towards net zero, rather than inadvertently acting as a barrier because of the lack of systems that are in place to enable that transition. So what sort of systems do I mean around that? I think there's a lot around data and digitalization that is going on at the moment and needs to go on into the future. And there's been some great work in the UK through the likes of Energy Data Task Force, talking about the presumed open nature of data. And I think, again, that there's a lot here that we can share across from the UK into Australia about how to make use of open data to facilitate best choices, both from a sort of network investment perspective, but also from a consumer perspective as well, and inform the consumer as to what's going on, allow them to make their own choices in an informed way rather than try and force certain decisions upon consumers. So that whole embracing of what we might call a DSO role moving forward rather than a DNO or DNSP role that we have today, and Jill mentioned sort of dynamic operating envelopes and so on. I think what we need to have increasingly is more joined upness between the network side, who kind of understand how many amps and volts have I currently got in my system at a particular point, and then the other players in the market, the VPP operators, for example, who have got people lined up who are willing to offer flexibility services to the grid. And there needs to be something in the middle that then communicates between those two things and says, right, here's what we need, here's what we're looking for at the moment, what can you do for us, and how can you ensure the integrity of the network is maintained? And I think that's a huge opportunity area, both in the UK and Australia, to kind of to interleave those two different systems. And again, engaging with the broader players in the value chain to enable that to happen is going to be absolutely key for that to be successful.
Great. And Jill, I don't know whether you want to add to that, or just from your perspective, I'm curious to know if you're seeing some of these gaps that Networks Australia has, and you're sort of looking out beyond the country, out to places like the UK, just to say, actually, we could do with working with other countries on this particular area, or the flip side, there may be areas, where Australia is leading in particular network development that you think actually we could help other countries. Again, I just welcome your views on some of those areas we might be able to collaborate on.
So I think for Australia, coming back to the UK, it's probably, we're not there yet in Australia in terms of how we're going to respond fully to minimum demand, which is a critical issue in each region, particularly in South Australia and Queensland, and increasingly in Victoria. And how do you manage that in a way that's equitable rather than just dropping rooftop solar off the system? I also think data is important, but I also think the UK has a tremendous experience in demand side response. That's a well-established, decade-long, many decades approach to flexibility. And Australia just doesn't have that kind of comfort and experience in trusting that the demand side can deliver significant system support and services. So while we're just starting with our wholesale demand response, and that's large scale in Australia, while busily trying to engage customers in delivering flexible services, but we don't really have that strong foundational experience in the demand side that the UK does have. And I think that's a piece that's really missing in Australia. I certainly find it frustrating. So yeah, I kind of think we need to learn from the UK on trusting the demand side, and which will also help answer the minimum demand problem if we can provide foot room. And we can kind of give you a heads up on how we're going to tackle minimum demand. Great. In local areas.
Thanks. And so perhaps one last question, and maybe to Phil and Mark Patterson. So clearly networks are going to have to play an important role here for net zero. But do we really feel the 20th century sort of tools that we're using are really going to be fit for purpose for what's needed in terms of what Mark and Jill have just talked about there? So Phil, maybe start with you, and then Mark P, and then maybe come back to Mark Sprossen just to wrap up.
So I think the answer to that has to be a no. You go back to the 20th century and sort of demand was sacrosanct, and you dispatched generation to meet demand. Going forwards, I think increasingly it's going to be a question of non-time critical demand. So when my EV is charged within reason, when the water for my shower is heated up, that can happen at times when the energy is available rather than dispatching a generator to meet it. And I do think, going back to what Jill was saying about the supplier, I think you may have been a little bit generous about our abilities in demand side response. I can see the suppliers taking a much greater role here and then becoming almost my energy manager. So if they choose when to heat my shower, they choose when to run my EV. It's much easier for them to balance their sort of position on the system, to avoid these sorts of, they could soak up the solar to some extent, and then they should be able to offer me a discount. So I can see a world where I get a proposition from a supplier rather than just pence per kilowatt hour of, I can do, if you allow me to manage your flexibility, I can give you a 10% discount, and then the grid works better, and just in general things are more productive, I suppose.
Thank you. And then Mark P, and then we'll do Mark S.
Well, I've got to say, Phil, I'm disappointed. Paul told us that we were going to get all our answers, all of our questions answered on this, that it was all sorted in the UK.
You have to pay for that, Mark. We don't do it for free.
Absolutely. So, yeah, look, I think I love your question, Paul. It's exactly the right question. And I think that one of the big challenges we've all got is that our sector has had pretty much 100 years of fairly comparatively steady state change, or steady state incremental change. And we've been very used to that world. The same toolkit, more or less, has worked very well for a long time. I think what we're facing now is this very transformational upheaval, which is kind of decadal in its nature. And it does actually, we all have the propensity to, as they say, what is it? Status quo bias, and also confirmation bias. We tend to kind of fall back to the things that we know, whereas I think the kind of foresight that's been exercised in initiatives such as FPSA really helps sort of zoom out and say, well, yes, a number of those 20th century tools are still very relevant, but there's a whole range of other tools that we need, just given that the nature of the transformation, the challenges are materially different in many cases.
Yeah, thank you. And Mark Sporson, with yourself, and then we might need to move on to the next panel.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief for you, Paul. So Phil's already covered off kind of some of the retailer bundling and some of those kind of areas, and great punch and Mark, which I completely echo, by the way, as well. So I'll just touch on a couple of really quick things. So looking back more at the network side, I guess, given this is the networks panel, I would say it's not just about operation, it's also about planning. So if we are going to have this bow wave of EVs, let's say, for argument's sake, as one technology, not standing in the way and not slowing down the process for getting those EV charge points connected is going to be crucial. So having better tools and systems to actually enable you to fast track those applications, if you like, it is going to be absolutely key. So we've seen recently, yesterday there was an announcement from Ofgem regarding the £300 million fund to enable green recovery, which is great, which is looking at, amongst other things, getting more EV infrastructure into service stations and key trunk roads and so on. We've already seen some network operators improving their tools and making the customer engagement side of things easier. So for example, you've got Northern Power Grid, who've got their auto design proposition whereby people can just log on through a web portal, fill in their connection details and get an instant quote as to how much it would be to connect their EV charge point, their heat pump, their new house, whatever it might be, which is a significant improvement on having to write into the DNO and wait for the response and all the studies to come back. I think all those kind of tools that enable us to do things quicker are going to be key. And the last point I would make as well is it's about bringing together the energy side and the transport side as well. So particularly with EVs, it's about understanding the modeling, not just of amps and volts, but also of transport flows and of dwell times and all of these things that you need when you're thinking about using charge points. So I'd just like to again point out one great initiative is going on there with SP Energy Networks on the Charge project, where they're looking at bringing those two kind of circles of the Venn diagram together and interleaving them together into one all-encompassing tool, which again I think will vastly improve outcomes for charge point operators, customers and networks.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, again, thank you all. It's a rapid round of views there, but all really, really rich information that's really helpful, and some great insight, but also, again, some great suggestions there around where we might be able to work together. So thank you all. Again, if you could turn your cameras off now, and I will introduce the final panelists. So we have James Kennedy, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Tritium. We've got our own practice manager for transport at the Energy Systems Catapult, Talia Scoofer. We've got a couple of companies that are not actually related but sound very similar. We've got Dan Hilson, who's the CEO from EV Energy with an I, and also Nick Woolley, who's the CEO from EV.Energy with a Y. So welcome all of you. Again, let's just kick off with somewhat of a sort of general question here, and it's interesting that this has sort of come up already in the sort of chat room. But so Talia, the UK set this target for 2030 for a ban on sale of internal combustion engine vehicles. So what's your view? Is this achievable? And what are the barriers that we need to overcome here?
So last year, the EV Energy Task Force started looking at these problems and started looking at how do we make the transition easier for consumers, but also how do we prepare the energy system for the high rates of uptake of electric vehicles. And still, all the issues that EVIT identified are relevant with the 2030 ban. So we're looking at areas like obviously the public charging infrastructure, but also how do we make the experience easier for consumers? How do we provide the right information, and how do we create kind of like a seamless operation? So looking at things like interoperability and communication between devices, between electricity supply and charge point operation, but also communication to the vehicle to allow things like smart charging, but also to make the experience and to have the right information flowing from the right sources. I think it was mentioned before as well that data will play a key role, and if we need to, and if we want to allow the flexibility from electric vehicles to be harnessed, then we would need to have that data flow. So I think interoperability of devices and communication would be a key for that, but also things like planning and how do we ensure that the electricity system is able to cope with the additional demand. But how do we design a system for the future that is not only looking at the EVs, but also looking at the electrification of heat or other sources in the future? So that integrated planning at local system is also quite important, I think.
Fantastic. And so, and James is with us, by the way, but just doesn't have a camera. So in case you're just wondering where he is. So, but James, I'll maybe come to you next. Just and perhaps Dan after that. Again, would be interested to hear from the Australia side. Do you think Australia will now, there's a potential to follow suit in terms of what the UK is doing here, and if so, again, what do you see as the barriers for rolling out of electrification of transport in Australia? So James first, and I'll come to Dan.
Yeah, so we're a little bit of a backwater at this point in time. I think there's a definite opportunity here for Australia to be learning lessons from countries that are ahead of us. But right now this is a fairly major concern for us, I think, that right now we're well on the way to being a dumping ground for internal combustion vehicles. So as various countries around the world do adopt, targets for electric vehicles and dates where you will be banned from buying an internal combustion vehicle, there's no real trend in that direction here in Australia. So this I think is a distinct problem. I mean, as far as the grid side of things goes, I'm far less concerned. If there was all of the EVs on the road all of the cars in the road in Australia were electric vehicles, you're talking about a 14 or 15% increase in electricity consumption, which could quite easily be handled with either the middle of the day solar generation peak or the middle of the night, your standard overnight cheap power. But the problem there, of course, is how that's managed. And that's the difference between success and failure here. Success is this EV charging is managed. They charge when the power is available. They can mitigate excess solar in the middle of the day. The benefits are fantastic. Failure is not managing them at all. Everyone gets home and plugs in at 6 o'clock. You'd need to double the size of the transmission system. This would be a nightmare scenario. So the difference between getting this right and getting this wrong is actually doing something about how this is managed. That's a really key thing. Longer term, there's some interesting stuff here which brings up a lot of the social issues that were talked about before. Between you end up with a haves and have-nots society very quickly, in that, I mean, lithium battery prices are halving every 4 years. That trend seems to be continuing. It won't be very far away where somebody with an electric vehicle and a small stationary battery pack in the house has an entirely viable option to go completely off-grid. I mean, even a low-end EV can run a typical house, including the air conditioning, for 3 or 4 days. So if you're charging that car at work during the day off cheap rooftop solar, you drive home, you run your house off it at night, there's a real risk here that you have, at least to start with, the more affluent sections of the population dropping off the grid entirely. And so how you solve this particular social problem is something that's a more long-term concern, I think, but it is a very real concern.
I've seen lots of nodding heads from Dan and Nick here. So, so Dan, I'll come to you, then to Nick. So, Dan, yeah, I mean, your views on Australia and the challenges there.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, we're operating in the UK and Australia quite extensively, and I think, you know, the characterisation of the UK is, you know, there's a huge amount of investment going in. You know, 1.3 billion into charging. You know, the equivalent in Australia is about 20 million. In UK, I sort of the challenge is about scaling quickly and spending wisely. That would be the way I would, you know, there's just so much capital coming in, whereas in Australia, it's really about starting with very little government support, particularly central government support, and how to sort of scale up from that position, which is, you know, I guess a purely commercial almost scale up scenario. There is some government support coming from the state governments at the moment, but you know, from the central government, there's very little support. So, the benefit of the Australian situation is that we can plan. We're doing a lot of planning with very little actual action. You know, so our system will be very, very well planned. In the UK, in a sense, it rolled out even from the start very quickly, and so, you know, there was multiple charging networks with multiple different cards, and it was all quite, you know, a little bit more chaotic. So there is opportunity in Australia, but, you know, in terms of a sort of question about how to get political support in Australia, I mean, it's sort of going to come from the consumers, but ultimately at the moment, you know, we have very little supply of vehicles in Australia. You know, people aren't interested in supplying Australia because of that political environment. That was the case in the UK, you know, 3 or 4 years ago. But now it's really hitting Australia that ultimately the cars that people want to drive aren't being supplied, and therefore there's not a lot of consumer choice. So, you know, there is a really significant challenge in Australia to get this moving. And I think more of a challenge than people actually realise in terms of getting the supply into the country and getting some visibility.
Great, thanks, Dan. And Nick, I mean, you're also active in both countries, I understand, and so again, I welcome your views not only of some of the challenges that we've just heard from Talia, James, and Dan, but also just to start move the conversation a little bit into where maybe you see some of the collaboration opportunities, because I think particularly in transport, you know, the two countries are at a very different level of maturity here, but that can also open up you know, other opportunities for collaboration. So yeah, over to you, Nick, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the challenges are quite common across the two geographies. So we talked about the cost of electric vehicles. The cost of electric vehicles needs to fundamentally come down. The supply of electric vehicles is quite different in the two geographies, but driven partly because of the central government policies that are different in the two geographies. And then one of the key challenges, of course, is electric vehicle charging. To get widespread adoption of electric vehicles, we need to have very, very simple and straightforward charging services. And we also need to get electric vehicles fully integrated into the energy system. And that's where I think there's a lot of commonality between the two markets in terms of the challenges that we all face. I mean, as consumers, when we buy electric vehicles, we want the charging service to be super simple. We want to be able to just get that electric vehicle. It's super exciting to drive. It's got a lot of tech inside it, but charging is like the real pain point associated with owning an electric vehicle. So often we find, customers come home, they plug in their electric vehicle at peak times during the early evening, and if it's not smart and controlled, then this is really bad for the energy system. And so I think what the UK is doing in some of this regard is they're pushing forward things like smart charging technologies. So there's obviously been grants associated with smart chargers in the home that has encouraged a lot of the infrastructure to be going into people's homes to be smart and connected, which is great from an electricity grid perspective, because then that can be managed according to grid requirements. I think the other thing the UK is doing is also pushing forward with flexibility auctions and auctioning out that flexibility. The networks are being really good at coming forward with their requirements for flexibilities at the LV, the HV, the EHV level in their network, and they're asking electric vehicles, other distributed energy resources as well, to provide services into the grid, which is fantastic from a perspective of controlling and managing demand at the local grid level. And then I also think that within the UK market as well, there's electricity retailers, and I think in Australia as well, to a certain extent, are coming forward with propositions that make this charging simple and effective for customers and enable them to get access to charging services that are fully integrated with the grid, aligned with when renewables are available, aligned with when perhaps their solar is available. We've talked about the massive uptake of solar PV in Australia, which is clearly an opportunity to be paired with electric vehicle charging. So I think between the fundamental technical behaviors in the two markets, there's actually a lot of commonality, and there's a lot that both markets are developing to actually bring forward and deliver services that hopefully work really, really well and effectively for consumers.
Great. Now, I appreciate that you guys are heavily involved more on the electrification of transport, but I do want to make sure we've just had a very quick conversation as to whether there's any other collaboration areas in other transport areas. I know Australia, for instance, is also looking at, for instance, at hydrogen extensively as well. So I don't know whether James, Dan, maybe start with James, just and then I'll come to Talia for the UK side. But James, Dan, what trends are you seeing in other transport areas, heavy duty vehicles, rail, etc. in Australia? And are there potential opportunities to work together in those areas?
Yeah, well, let me preface my comments by saying that we make EV charging infrastructure, so I'm a little bit biased. I would have actually given you quite a different answer on the heavy vehicle transport probably only 2 or 3 years ago, and would have said that your long haul semi-trailer type trucks were almost certainly going to be hydrogen. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think now they're almost certainly going to be electric. All the usual suspects, the big truck manufacturers, the big truck engine manufacturers, and a few of the new upstarts, Tesla and Nikola, etc., have all got semi-trailer type trucks, prototypes at least, running on the road with real world numbers, 800,000 kilometer ranges with 40 ton on the back. At that point, hydrogen is basically fighting against cheap mass-produced lithium batteries, and I don't think that's a fight that hydrogen can win at this point in time. You look at the sheer production capacity being built out right now for lithium batteries for light vehicles, and that continues to drive the cost down, the performance up. I think that ship has sailed already as far as hydrogen goes, quite frankly. With some of the other modes where we've been in discussions with a couple of the train operators here in Australia that are looking at using battery electric for some of their heavy freight haulage routes that are currently diesel. So yeah, there's certainly some interesting things going on there. But yeah, like I said, we're biased, of course. But
sure. I appreciate you need to be a little bit impartial. But Dan, again, anything to add on that? I'm conscious we've.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. I mean, in terms of the fleet electrification, because of the lack of subsidies in Australia, the TCO on fleets works better than consumer in many cases. So you're seeing, fleets being the area of focus, and absolutely in municipalities in Australia, there's a lot of activity in the heavy vehicles. We've got C Electric here, who's a manufacturer that's doing good stuff, and an Australian business. So that's been great. Buses, obviously a huge booming sector in the UK, but also the New South Wales government, Australia's committed to going 100% electric, and that's really happening in the sense of every new bus being bought in New South Wales, 8,000 strong fleet, a very, very big fleet. So I think the bus market will be an area of great collaboration, and we're already doing projects in both markets, in the bus market, and I think that's one where you've got the right-hand drive in both markets, and you've got bodybuilders locally, but chassis and batteries, and other things being produced internationally. So there's a lot of collaboration that can happen in that particular market. So yeah, the heavy vehicle side I think is really exciting.
Brilliant. So Tali, I'll come to you. Sorry, Nick, I'll come to you in a second. I'd really like you, if we can wrap up with you, Nick. But one question I'd just like to pose to you is around digitalization and data, and whether there's more that needs to happen there in the transport space and collaboration opportunities there. So we'll wrap up on that question. But Tali, just before we get there, maybe you could just give the UK view on where you see, again, trends in sort of the broader transportation space.
Yeah, so there are definitely sectors like maritime, for example, that they're moving towards hydrogen or ammonia fuels. But as it was mentioned before, road freight in particular, there's still quite a few unknowns, I guess, on performance. We see vehicles coming into later stages of development on both the battery side, but also on the electrified road systems, with examples that we've seen in Sweden and Germany. But then also looking at hydrogen fueled vehicles, and it depends on the operation type and what would be, at the end of the day, what would be those characteristics of the duty cycle, payload, that the powertrain would be more suitable. But there's definitely lack of understanding, I think, at the moment, at how suitable each of these technologies. But yeah, so I think if we don't move soon to some trials and demonstrations, and I think the UK government is pushing towards that, it's not clear yet which pathway would be more suitable for the different fleet types.
Yeah, and it sounds from what James and Dan said, maybe those demonstrations are areas where we could work together on. So yeah. So Nick, I want to make sure we finish on time. So I'll just finish on this sort of last question, because I'm keen, as I say, to see is there more we should be doing in the transport space, particularly from a digitalization and data point. This came up in some of the other panel sessions. So I just wonder what your views are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think digitalization, this sector is so exciting because it is the confluence of technology and also new technology and the energy system. And there's a whole load of new technology being driven out. I think from a consumer perspective, digitalization is super important to make the services really simple. We've talked, people have mentioned and alluded to rapid charging in the UK being very difficult. There's a lot of interoperability challenges. I think digitalization can play a real role in simplifying those services for customers. I think from the EVs and infrastructure perspective, all of the infrastructure that we're deploying now is pretty much connected. So they're all IoT devices. That's the cars and the chargers themselves as well. And so we've got all of this information that we can use to help us understand how we integrate electric vehicles, the behaviors of users to deliver a lower carbon energy system. And then I think from the grid perspective, digitalization is super critical because grids can provide real-time signals on their requirements. Energy retailers can provide real-time signals of what's happening in the wholesale market. The weather system we can forecast what's going on in the weather to understand when solar generation might be outputting. And we put all of these things together to actually drive a consumer experience that's digital by nature, but actually delivers value for all the stakeholders, including energy networks, retailers, society as a whole, and end consumers and electric vehicle owners.
Fantastic. So we've got to 10 o'clock and I'm conscious people will need to move on to other meetings. So again, thank you very much, our panelists on the transport area. That I thought was, again, some really great insight like the other panels, and we'll really pick out some of these suggestions that have been made. I've also just posted, so I meant to do this earlier, so apologies, this is last minute, but just the last poll question there. So for those of you that are still remaining, if you could try and quickly give your views on that poll. And we'll just leave this open just for one more minute. But we will collate all this information from today. And thank you again to all our panelists. Thank you to Austrade for partnering with us on this and helping us set this up. to Alberto and Tabitha in particular, and thank you all for participating today. And as I say, let's hope that this is the start of a journey here, and let's see if we can have some follow-up sessions to this to delve into some of those collaboration opportunities. So thank you again, and have a lovely rest of the evening in Australia and a lovely rest of the day in the UK. Thank you very much.